wait, what's a woman? Left-wing progressives are like, anyone who identifies as a woman. So I'm like, okay, deal. Deal. I identify as a woman.
Zuby, this is the first time I've talked about this subject that we've gone through today. And the reason is I've been nervous about even tackling. Welcome to the brand new Astin-Gregory podcast, the show where we seek to understand how do we live free and prosper in these unique times. The predecessor to this show was the Pandemic podcast, which went on to reach over 25 million downloads as we sought answers to the questions that most people seem unwilling to ask. But we're now back bigger and bolder, still trying to make sense of the world with our critical questioning, challenging mainstream narratives, but also now increasingly asking how do we thrive in these unique times? Whether it's looking at how do we optimize our health or find financial independence, we're going to be bringing you some amazing guests to explore these deep questions. If you'd like to go even deeper with us, then you can join our supporter program where you'll get early access to our episodes, behind the scenes content, the opportunity to watch our interviews live and more. To find out how you can get involved, go to danastingregory.com/supporter. You'll find our show on all the major platforms from YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple, and more. And we cannot wait to share what we have with you. Our guest today is Zuby, rapper, thinker, podcaster, and even women's weightlifting world record holder. Yes, you heard me right, which actually hints into what we're going to be talking about today, which is the rise of gender ideologies. Now, I will let you in for a little clue, actually. We actually got together to talk about the challenges that modern men are facing. We wanted to talk about this idea of toxic masculinity, but what preceded that was an expansive discussion around the rise of gender ideologies and how they've permeated society and whether they make sense. So you're in for an absolutely thought-provoking, sometimes eyebrow-raising episode. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome, Zuby, to the show.
Good to see you too, Dan.
Pleasure. Well, now a lot has changed since we last spoke. I think we spoke in 2021. So we're now, coming up to 4 years on. And personally, I relocated from Bristol to Bournemouth. And in preparation for our conversation today, I noticed that you have a bit of a history here. And I was reading in the local newspaper from something like 2009 that there was an incident that that happened in Bournemouth with you. What tell us about that? What went on?
Oh boy, haven't spoken about that one for a long time, man. I'm assuming you're talking about the arrest due to mistaken identity at Bournemouth train station.
That's
so
right.
Yeah, that wasn't fun. We can look back on it and smile, but it was not a fun moment. I'd actually been selling my CDs in Southampton that day. I'd been in Southampton all day long, promoting my music, and I jumped on the train to go back to Bournemouth as I usually do. And when I came out of the train, as it pulled into Bournemouth train station, I heard a bunch of shouting, right? As the train was pulling up, I noticed a lot of armed police on the platform. So I thought, I don't know, maybe there's some sort of terrorist threat or, something along those lines. It's not that rare to see it in an airport, train station, something like that. But, I step off the platform, I hear shouting, and one of the police officers actually pushes me, physically pushes me backwards towards the train. And I hear, stop, put your hands up, get down on your ground, whatever. And I'm looking around trying to see what's going on. And all the guns are aimed at me.
Wow.
And so I had probably about five guns trained on me. And it's hard to explain what's going on in my brain at this time. It felt very surreal. But I just complied. I had no idea what's going on, obviously. So I go down on my knees. I have to lie face down on the ground. I mean, this is a busy train platform. It's about 6 p.m. Bournemouth train station on a Saturday. So it's quite busy. And everyone's obviously looking like, whoa, what's going on? And they put these handcuffs on me. They tell me I'm under arrest for a Section 1 firearm offense. I remember that very clearly. And they sort of marched me off to one of the side rooms in the train station. And they're asking me all of these questions, which are not making sense to me. Well, firstly, me being arrested isn't making any sense because I obviously have not done anything wrong or committed any crime, let alone enough to call out a whole firearm unit. I think for non-British listeners, it's important to remember that typical British police don't even carry firearms. So they've kind of called out the big boys for this one. And they're talking about some incident that happened in Basingstoke. I hadn't been to Basingstoke that day, right? So they're talking about Basingstoke and they're talking about a gun, and I'm quite literally like, I'm answering them, but I don't even know what they're talking about. So, they're saying this in Basingstoke. I'm like, I haven't been to Basingstoke today. I'm coming from Southampton. And they're like, what's in your backpack? I'm like, a few CDs that I didn't sell and some flyers. Like, I'm a musician. I've been promoting my music in Southampton. So I'm very confused at this moment, but I'm also, initially it was quite scary. But by this point, I had no idea what's going on. But once the guns were no longer trained on me, I wasn't afraid anymore. So I'm just having a conversation with these police officers. They're asking me questions. I'm just answering them honestly. And I start even telling them a little bit about my story, because they're looking at these CDs. Like, the CD has me on it. The flyers have me and so, I can see the confusion in their faces. They're a bit like, this doesn't seem like the type of guy who's been chasing someone around with a gun in Basingstoke earlier on in the day, right? So I think at this moment, they themselves are already having some sort of doubts and questions, but I think, they have a process for these things, so they're kind of just going through it. After they'd done the search, they led me back over the bridge in the train station to the other side, and there's like a police car waiting for me. I'm literally in handcuffs. People are looking at me like, gosh, like, what's this guy done? He must be some sort of drug lord or something. And so I'm in the police car with two officers. One of them is driving, one of them is sitting next to me, and they're just asking me questions. And at this point, they definitely think they've got the wrong guy. Like, I think they know at this point, because they're asking me questions, and I'm like, so this is not so long after. This was the year after I graduated from Oxford.
Yeah.
So I'm there telling them, I'm an Oxford University graduate. I got my degree in computer science last year. I'm an independent musician. So, I've been traveling around promoting my music and so, and obviously I'm being very polite and kind of, and I can tell like they're both a bit like, yeah, we've effed up here, haven't we? Like we've completely got the wrong guy. So I get to the police station. And I think I had to like give my name or something. So I'm standing in the police station. I'm still in handcuffs at this point. I'm in there for about 10 minutes waiting. Someone comes out and is like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And so they'd completely got the wrong person. So I've just gone through this whole ordeal. Yeah, I've just gone through this whole ordeal. And they offered to drop me. I was living at my parents' house, staying at my parents' house at the time. And they offered to drive me back, but my van was actually still at Bournemouth train station. So I was just like, you know what, just take me to the train station car park. Like, I'll drive myself back home. They're like, are you sure? Like, are you, because, they're like, man, this guy's probably traumatized or something. I was like, yeah, it's fine. Like, I'll drive myself back home. So I get back home. My mom opens the door and I was just like, you guys are not going to believe what just happened. And so, I think my parents, to be honest, were probably more upset than I was. Like, they were, no, not probably, definitely. I was kind of like, I'm very, I don't know, I'm extraordinarily low in neuroticism. So as much as I did not like the situation, I was kind of just like, okay, that was weird, but I got through it and I didn't get shot, right? But to tell that story to my mother in particular, but also my dad, and they know that the police have just been like aiming guns at their innocent son. They are not happy, right? Like, they are not happy at all. And then some police officers came to the house to visit and to like talk through it. And then I'll be honest with you, that whole incident was weird. But then the following week may have been even weirder, because this is when it got out into the press and into the media. So for several days, we had like BBC and ITV and all these media vans like outside the house, and reporters, and it was on the front cover of the Metro. The free paper in London.
Yes,
the Metro paper. It was on the front cover 2 days running.
Wow.
So two days in a row. So the first day, it didn't show my face. Like, they didn't know who it was, but it was a picture of me actually with one of the guns aimed at me, like lying down on the ground at the station. And it was like, who is this guy kind of thing. It was like, commuter nightmare at Bournemouth train station. And keep in mind, I've got like loads of friends who live in London. My sister's living and working in London at the time. So this happens. And, a few people at this point know it's me. But then the following day, my face is on the front cover of the Metro. So my friends and some of my family members are on the train and are on the underground in London. And they're seeing people with the paper open. And my face is on the front cover.
Wild.
Right? And it said something like,
What did that go for? What's the scourge?
Well, I think this was, if you remember, I think it was 2007. Do you remember there was that guy who got shot in London, Jean-Charles de Menezes? I remember his name. I think that they had thought he was a terrorist suspect or something, and they chased him onto the tube, and the police ended up killing this innocent Brazilian guy. And around this time, you have to remember there was quite a lot of heightened sort of like terrorism threat in the UK, sort of like 2008 time. There was a lot of heightened threat. So there was this thing about mistaken identity, and then there was the question of like police conduct. There was the question of like, is this a racial issue? White police officers, black man, is this like so there were like all these sort of different angles and narratives, and they wanted to like ask me all of the it was very weird and surreal, partially because I had been spending, at this point, I'm there promoting and pushing my music, and it's crazy, you're trying to reach out to the media as an independent musician, and it's really hard to get attention, right? Like they don't really want to pay attention. And then all of a sudden this thing happens, and all of the media channels now want to speak to me, but they want to speak to me about getting arrested on mistaken identity, and they want to talk about are the police institutionally racist, and they've got all their different angles, and they want to push you in this way and that way. And I only ended up doing like one or two interviews because I just didn't it wasn't the attention I wanted for the reason I wanted it. And I didn't want to kind of be used I didn't want to be used for any narrative. I was very conscious of the fact that, they want to kind of spin it this way or spin it that way, sometimes which is not really in line with the truth. And at this point, there hadn't been any investigation to find out what actually happened. So at this point, it's all just speculation. People are coming up with their own narratives. Some people are saying, oh, they thought he was a terrorist. Other people are saying, oh, this was a clear incidence of racism. Other people are saying this and this. And it's like, look, I don't know. I don't know why this happened. I don't know who they thought I was. I don't know where the wires got crossed. All of this stuff came out months later because the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPCC, they did a full investigation into it. So months down the line, I actually got access to all of the transcripts from the 3 different police forces that were involved: Hampshire, Dorset, and British Transport Police. I saw exactly what happened, what had transpired. I even saw some of the CCTV of the incident that actually did happen in Basingstoke. But I didn't know any of this at the time, and I didn't want to kind of go on TV or go on the radio and start just saying things without really knowing what the facts were and are. I've always been like that. I care a lot about the truth. I care about authenticity. I don't like to push and promote and lean into, some of those narratives could have been quite expedient for me, right? Like I could have been that person who comes out and, just like, all right, I'm just going to jump on the, all the cops are racist and police brutality bandwagon, right? But I didn't even know if that was the thing, right? Some people are like, oh, obviously this wouldn't have happened if you were white. And I'm like, maybe, I don't know. It depends on why this happens. Have white people been arrested on mistaken identity? Yeah, probably more than black people statistically. So let me just hold fire until I actually know what happened. So yeah, that was that's what happened with that story. It was wild, but I'm glad I reacted how I did, because honestly, somebody who was not as calm as I was could have easily been killed in that situation, and it would have been that would have been really, really bad. So if anyone, I pray that nobody listening to this is ever in any type of situation like this. But if you are, just comply and deal with it later. Don't try to run off. Don't try to like fight the police or whatever like that. That doesn't end well. As wrong as the situation might be, and as angry as you may feel or scared you may feel at the time, if you're in the 0.0001% of people who's ever in that situation, just keep calm and carry on.
Yes, the good old-fashioned British way. Keep calm and carry on. But I won't look at Bournemouth train station the same way now. But that is wild. But interestingly, with that kind of media approach, they're trying to put a narrative on it. At that point, because obviously, the last few years have awakened a lot of us to the power of media to spin narratives and create grand narratives. At that point, had you even become skeptical in that way? Was that kind of a first-hand exposure to the kind of media spin, or had you already got a kind of sense that this thing was going on?
I was already aware of it, to be honest, man. A lot of people ask me, like, when was I red-pilled, or like, when did I become awake or whatever? I've kind of been like that since I was a child. Certainly since my teens. I've always asked a lot of questions and been intellectually curious. And I've always been someone who doesn't care to just go with the flow and go with the narrative. I'm not someone who's sort of naturally rebellious in that sense, but I've always been a critical thinker. And I've always, I don't know, had this ability to maybe see patterns where other people don't, and not feel like I need to do something just because other people are doing it. It's like, to give you an example of this, I mean, I went to boarding school overseas from the age of 11. And, I was in boarding school for 7 years and then university for 3 years. And obviously throughout those teenage years, young adult years, people are doing like all kinds of things. I've never smoked a cigarette. I've never tried any drug. When lots of people around me were like doing all this stuff and there's all this peer pressure going on or whatever, a lot of people give into peer pressure pretty easily. And I was just like immune to it. I was just like, no, like, I'm not doing that. Cause I was like, oh, go on. I was like, no, I don't want to. Like, you can't get me to do something if I don't want to. And like, I just won't. And unless there's like a good reason for me to do it, I'll just be like, no. So I guess I've always had that thing in me where I'm not like skeptical to a degree that makes me like a cynical person, but I just ask a lot of questions and I care a lot about the truth. I care about the truth more than any agenda. I don't have some agenda that I'm pushing. I have my beliefs. I have my viewpoints. I have, and I'm not afraid to share what they are. But ultimately, I just want to know what is true. And I've known that I remember being younger and reading all about various forms of propaganda that have existed in different times in history and in different countries, and, propaganda. And I was like, well, that hasn't ended. That never ended. Propaganda still very much exists. It's existed our entire lives. So I'm not someone who's like, oh, everything in the media is fake. No, that's the opposite extreme, right? No, not everything is fake, but they do have a point of view. They do have biases. If not, why would there be like right-wing newspapers and left-wing newspapers, right? If their goal was just to report the news, then all news would just be straight down the center and objective. But we know that's not true. We all know that the Guardian is left-leaning, and, the Daily Mail is right-leaning, or in the U.S., Fox News is right-leaning and Republican, and, CNN and MSNBC like there. So it's been like that for a long time. And it's just like, well, that's how it is. So yeah, they're going to have their angle, and it doesn't always mean they're directly lying, but they might want to lead you in a certain way or push or promote a certain agenda.
Yeah. Well, if you're new to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast, then you'll soon discover that we have tangents on this show. We came here to talk about the crisis of masculinity. I just wanted to, for me, I just wanted to get that story because it's so pertinent where I'm based right now, and we'll never look at the situation again. And it's interesting though, because I want to spin now to talk about that topic of the crisis of masculinity, and go from one incident that, in many ways in today's society, it's almost like people are seeking those kind of like random YouTube moments to springboard their career. At that time, you were actually deliberately trying to get people's attention, yet you find yourself in an unfortunate situation. So I want to talk about another moment, which actually was a viral moment, your your women's deadlift attempt.
It wasn't an attempt. It was easily done.
Easily achieved. But so my question is, did you back in 2019? I mean, I've only been paying attention to these kind of narratives in particular when it comes to gender in recent years, because it's become, you can't even ignore it anymore. But the question I have is, did you start this gender confusion movement with that video, or was that a cultural comment on what was happening in the world?
No, it was the latter. It was the latter. That whole issue really went mainstream in 2015.
Yes.
And from 2015, I was having a lot of personal and private conversations with people about some of this. And I remember specifically in 2017 having a conversation actually with some of my family members about this whole issue and talking about what it was going to lead to. And this is back in 2017. So again, it wasn't so prominent and in your face at this time, but I remember just saying like, yeah, this is going to affect women's sports. This is going to affect all of these things, because if the narrative is a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, then let's do some second and third order thinking here. What is going to stop a man or men from just saying, hey, I'm a woman, and going into all sorts of female spaces, whether they're changing rooms, whether it's sports competitions, whether it's prisons, all of these things. And in 2017 or 2016, saying these things to, the average person would have sounded like you're being ridiculous and maybe overly alarmist, and you're trying to make a big deal out of nothing. And I was just like, no, this is going to happen. It's inevitable. And then lo and behold, 2 years later, I myself become the British women's deadlift record holder. So it was just social commentary. And when I posted that back in February 2019, even at that point, very few people were speaking up about the issue. Everyone was afraid of being called a bigot or being called transphobic, or some people were just kind of apathetic. Other people didn't really know that it was going on. So I kind of blew the lid off of that issue to some degree. And yeah, the reaction to it was crazy. I did not know that was going to be the thing that put me on millions of people's radar, but God works in mysterious ways.
Before we continue, I want to let you know that in order to sustain this show, we're now partnering with brands that truly represent the values that we stand for. Ultimately, with the goal of helping you to discover products and services that can make a difference to the quality of your life, whilst helping us to grow the impact of our show. Have you noticed the financial world is shifting? Inflation is eating away at savings, banks are becoming harder to trust, and central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are looming on the horizon, threatening to erode financial autonomy as we know it. If you've been thinking about crypto as a way to protect your wealth, but feel overwhelmed, worried about scams, or confused by all the technology, then you're not alone. This is exactly why we created the Navigating Digital Assets course, a fully updated, beginner-friendly course designed to help you to securely navigate the world of crypto and digital assets with confidence. This course has already helped over 500 people to gain clarity on how crypto works, how to invest safely, and how to secure your assets in an ever-changing financial landscape. With holistic guidance, jargon-free explanations, and £197 worth of bonuses, this course will give you the tools and confidence to navigate this paradigm shift in finance. And as a follower of this show, you can get 40% off the regular price and enroll for just £29. But don't wait, this offer will end soon. Visit danastingregory.com/NDA today and take the first step toward protecting your wealth and securing your financial independence. You'll find the link below this content. Okay, let's get back to our conversation with Zuby.
Things don't always pan out the exact way that we expect and anticipate, but from that moment, almost 6 years ago now, it's crazy to think that was almost 6 years ago. Things have gone from strength to strength, and I'm glad that a lot of times it's not rare for a social media post to go viral. It happens every single day, multiple times a day, but most people are not able to make anything of it and sustain it. But because I'd been putting in all this work over the past decade plus with my music, and at that point I'd started my podcast and really been, doing a lot of other things. By the time I got those opportunities and I was able to go on different shows, whether that's Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, all of these people, I was then already well suited to speak, not just on that issue, but on other ones. So I'm glad in a way that the spotlight wasn't really put on me until 2019, because if it had happened maybe 5, certainly 10 years earlier, I just would not have been well equipped enough to handle that. Whereas now I feel very comfortable speaking on not any issue, because I'm not informed on everything, but anything that's kind of in my wheelhouse in terms of like society and culture and that line of thinking. I feel very confident with that, whether I'm on stage or I'm on a podcast or wherever. It doesn't matter who I'm sitting in front of. So I'm glad it happened the way that it did.
And that's great self-awareness. I think it's so important as well, because we live in a time where everyone has an opinion on everything, and they're not always informed opinions. So having that self-awareness of knowing, where are the parameters of this conversation, and, where do I feel comfortable that I'm suitably informed to actually contribute to? I think it's such an important tacit, because so many people don't adhere to that. And it's all of a sudden we've got this noisy kind of alternate media scape, which creates polarization, divide, which I want to come back to talk to later. But clue us in on the reaction. You said obviously it went viral. You had a strong reaction. What were the reactions? Was it polarizing at that point? Was it supportive? What sort of reactions did you receive?
Yeah, well, as soon as I posted it, Dan, I was aware that I had done something. So at the time I remember specifically, I had 19,000 followers on Twitter at the time, 19,000. And I posted this thing, and within a couple of minutes, I knew something was going on, because the numbers, the likes, the retweets, it was just growing at a rate I had never seen before. I was just standing there holding my phone in my hand, and the numbers were just increasing in real time, which I'd never seen before. Like, it was just ticking up. And within about 15 minutes, the video had 10,000 views. Within an hour, it had something like 50,000. By the time I went to bed that night, 300,000. I wake up in the morning, 500,000, hits 1 million later in the day, 2 million, 3 million. Like, it just keeps on going. I remember I was growing. I remember my account was growing by about 100 followers per hour for about a month. 25,000, 30,000, 35,000. Like, my account just kept growing and growing. And the following day, I already had media reaching out to me. BBC, the Sunday Times, Sky News, Fox News, all these people just start reaching out to me. And so this is just going on for weeks and weeks. It's just kind of growing into this snowball. And I'm just saying yes to everything. Anyone who wants to interview me, I'm like, cool, sure. Like, let's do it. And then I start getting people reaching out to me from the USA. Steven Crowder, Tucker Carlson does a whole segment on it on his Fox News when he was still on Fox News at the nightly show. So the clip itself goes viral, but then like the interviews and people's reaction to it and so on, it was just kind of, it was just blowing up in the UK, in the US as well. And then one morning I wake up and my WhatsApp is flooded, my DMs are flooded, and everyone is like, yo, Joe Rogan just shouted you out. Joe Rogan mentioned that. And I'm like, wait, what's going on? And I listened to, so this is when Joe was still in California. So keep in mind, I'm in the UK at the time. So there's like, an 8-hour time difference. So his show from the last night is kind of like morning in the UK. So I wake up in the morning and I'm listening to the show and I'm like, what are these people talking about? And there's a whole segment, like a 2-minute segment in the show where he and Brian, that's Brian Callen he's with, right? Like, they're just talking about my deadlift, and he gives me a shout out, and at the end he's like, I'm going to follow this guy right now. Shout out to Zuby. And I was like, yo, this is crazy. So boom, now Joe Rogan is following me on Twitter, and we start chatting, and a couple months down the line, he invites me to do his show. I end up going to the States, spending 3 months over there, planned to go for about 2 weeks. I ended up staying 3 months. I did Joe's show, Dave Rubin's show. I went to see the Daily Wire. I did Ben Shapiro's Sunday special. I ended up doing so many things. But at the end of the trip, I was invited to the Pentagon. Got invited to freaking White House. Like, dude, this is crazy. Like this. This is all like catalyzed by a silly tweet with a 9-second video. But in terms of reactions, Matt, in terms of the reaction, it was super positive. It was super supportive because I'll tell you what, Dan, the thing is, to this day, no one has ever really been able to offer a reasonable pushback against it, because all that happened was I did a checkmate maneuver, because I was just like, many people had been arguing, coming up to this day, right? People are still having the logical and biological arguments of, why males shouldn't compete in female sports and so on, which is absurd. We even have to have these conversations. But I was just like, wait, what's a woman? And, these left-wing progressives are like, anyone who identifies as a woman. So I'm like, okay, deal. Deal. I identify as a woman. I'm like, hey, is Caitlyn Jenner a woman? They're like, oh, absolutely. Not just a woman, but a stunning, brave woman of the year 2015, right? This is a person who won, as a man, multiple Olympic gold medals. So I'm like, okay, if Caitlyn Jenner is a woman because she said so, I'm now a woman. And so either someone has to say, if someone's going to argue against it, they either have to say that I'm not really a woman, which by their own logic would be quote unquote transphobic, or they have to say, okay, well, I guess that's a woman, and therefore this is the British women's deadlift record holder. So it's like pick one. So there were people who right? So there were people who kind of like wanted to get mad at it, but it's like, well, what's your argument? Like, what's your argument against this? You've been telling all of us for all of these years that a woman is anyone who says that they're a woman. So if I say I'm a woman, then why wouldn't you? You're being hypocritical now if you say, oh no, that's not really a woman. So either you have to say, yeah, that's not really a woman, which is true because I'm not, or you have to say, okay, well, yeah, I guess that's a woman. So I guess what he did was valid.
I mean, was this even before Stranger Things? Because Stranger Things introduced this idea of living in the upside down, which I'm pretty clear we still are in the upside down, although some would say the recent election is a turning point to returning to a more upward way of facing. But that's, we could have a debate about that later on. But it is fascinating to witness that we live in a time where this is happening. And I saw a tweet from a teacher the other day saying he was reminiscing of the glory days when they would talk about the theory of evolution at school, and now it's gender studies. And but the question I have around that is, how did biological science get usurped by social science? And we've all seen during COVID that the scientific method in the biological sciences has come well under attack. But where is the scientific method in a social science that can literally lead to this kind of post-truth reality where anyone can define themselves as they see fit? How did that happen? How did we get here?
That's a great question, man. I think it really depends on how deep you want to go. If you really wanted to go deep into the academic reasonings, you'd have to talk about postmodernism, which is, I'm not a student of postmodernism, but boiled down, it's essentially the idea that objective reality doesn't exist and that everything is subjective. So everything becomes based on feelings. So anything can be, everything is open for interpretation, and it's all just a matter of opinions and power. That's certainly a part of it. And then you have academic fields, which used to be just totally fringe, of things like, gender theory, queer theory in particular. And so all of these ideologies kind of come from the fringes of academia. And so that's really where a lot of the roots of it started. But then I think the reason why it accelerated so much, let's say in the past 10 years, because I often point out around 2014, 2015, when the sort of gender madness really, really kicked off. And I think that there are a few reasons for it. I think one of them is just the fact that we have become so comfortable in the modern Western world, right? Because they're not having these debates across Africa and in the Middle East, and in most of the world, they're not having these debates, right? Certainly not for a decade. But, we've come so far just in terms of ease of survival and solving some of the big, giant problems that we've faced for pretty much all of history. War, pestilence, famine, drought, all of these things that used to, be killing people left, right, and center, we mostly worked out. And further to that, we also have worked out the whole equality thing, right? So does it mean that there is do we live in a time where there is zero racism and zero sexism and zero homophobia and all that? No, we don't. But it's certainly been at an all-time freaking low, right? And at a worldwide low. If you live in the UK, Canada, USA, so on, it's why when people want to attack others, particularly, I don't even want to make this overly political, but it's why amongst so many liberals and progressives, the way they always want to attack people is to call them racist, to call them sexist, to call them misogynist, to call them a homophobe, because it's like we're living in a society where these are considered one of the worst things you can be. If you were in a truly, truly racist society in time, actually calling someone a racist isn't even an insult, because they're just like, well, yeah, everyone's racist. But actually, we've come so far, we've progressed so much in the good way, where even just sticking that label on someone is actually quite a powerful weapon. We've done so much to fight against all forms of bigotry that we've kind of come full circle in a weird way, where it's now like, I like to, I don't even know the best way to put it. It's a bit like, in the game, like the old school game Pac-Man, like if you go all the way to the left and then you come back out on the right? You go all the way to the far left and you pop back out on the far right, or vice versa. And we've kind of got to the stage where things have overcorrected to the point where the fight for the past few years hasn't even really been about equality and fairness. It's just been an inversion of what people used to fight against, right? It went from anti-blackness to anti-whiteness. It went from people discriminating against women to people saying, oh, well, men are trash and it's okay to discriminate against men. It went from people being like, it went from gay bashing and very outright homophobia to actually being gay is even better. And in fact, like, gay is not enough. You need to be trans now. And we should it's overcorrected to such a point where it's just like, wait, hang on. I thought the goal was equality and treating people fairly and equally, socially, culturally, under the law. And I would say that we reached that point probably somewhere in like the 90s or the 2000s, maybe even early 2010s. But then they just kept going. The train kept moving and they overshot the mark. And I think that's why the obsession with transgenderism and gender ideology in general for the past decade has become such a big talking point and obsession in a way that it never used to be, just because people are looking for something to fight against. If you're someone who's always trying to fight for the underdog and drive societal change and fight against any type of phobia or ism or bigotry, then you always need an enemy. If that means you have to invent one and you have to start like creating problems where they didn't exist, then so be it. And that's very much what I've been seeing. I think that's why it's a big reason why so many people find what we colloquially refer to as like wokeness or, social justice warriors, that strand of progressivism. It's why people find it so annoying, because it's just, it gets to that point where you're just like, what are you even talking about? Like, what are you even doing? Yes, exactly. Like, what's your goal? Where does this train end? Where can we just like stop and just be like, okay, enough. We've made some good progress. Is it legal to unfairly discriminate? And no, like, actually it's not. Is there still going to be the odd person here or there who has a bigoted belief or thought or something? Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. Like, I don't care. Do I love that? No, I don't love it, but I also don't care. And I'm not walking around all day obsessing with what other people are thinking, I have a thought actually, which might sound controversial to some people, but I hold a belief that, like, I believe that people are entitled to their bigotry. Like, you have a right. You have a right to be, you have a right to be a bigot. Like, if you actually do harbor racist thoughts or sexist thoughts or whatever, it's like, okay, like, you have that right. Number one, I don't care what's in your brain. But number two, it's also like, well, how do you actually treat people? Like, if someone like wants to go out and like harm someone or violate their private property rights or like, discriminate against them in like some awful way or something, it's like, okay, well, that's a problem. But if it's like something that's just potentially in somebody's head, I don't care. Like, they've got a right to that. Just like you have a right to any other opinion. Again, if you want to enslave people or beat people up or run some type of like ethnic cleansing or something, okay, yeah, we've got a problem now. But if it's just like a thought that someone has, okay, we may not like it. And in fact, if that's the way you think and it's the way you treat people, most people aren't really going to want to be around you and associate with you, and you're going to kind of limit your joy in life and your opportunities and so on. But I believe people are entitled to that if they want to be. So that's why I don't spend a lot of time, like, I don't know, kind of fighting these ghosts, because it's just like, well, that exists in the same way human sin exists. Like, you can't completely get rid of it. You could create a society and an environment where it's minimized, but it's never going to go down to zero, because people are always going to be people.
The thing about that is, it actually reflects some of the broader societal problems where we've seen a similar approach, where trying to take anything to zero, whether it's zero COVID or zero car accidents, again, that concept of second and third order thinking, people don't look beyond the idea to see the consequences of that. We've already seen with free speech, if you try and suppress people's right to speak freely, they will often become more extreme. So actually, the prognosis of trying to suppress someone's viewpoint is actually more likely to exacerbate the problem. And that lovely social science field has actually already proven that. And the other point here, though, it leads to this idea that actually, unfortunately, is becoming a common issue now, is this idea of a pre-crime. Because what you're actually talking about is that this idea that someone could think something about something else or someone else that could be deemed harmful. And again, if we take the idea of harm being completely subjective, like what your tolerance level is of what would offend you versus mine or versus anyone else is entirely individual. So yes, there are some things I'm sure as humanity, well, actually, I'm not sure anymore, that we could actually get to a point of agreement on not anything in the world. What is deemed harmful as a whole, do not kill. Okay, you could probably find someone that would rationalize the opposite of that point. So it's how are we supposed to move forward if we can't define what is harmful? So this idea of pre-crime comes up, which I think is deadly, because we're now going to start seeing people getting arrested for potentially thinking something or doing something before they actually did. This whole subjectivity again kicks in, and we just end up in this merry-go-round, which comes back to the point of what's it all about and where's it all going, and how do we get off this train? Because frankly, where does it stop? As you said, and so my curiosity here is, in your view, where does this end? Where does this end? And particularly with the lens, I suppose, bringing it back to the gender story, where does this whole thing stop, and what impact is it actually having on men, women in society right now?
I think the impact at this point is pretty much all downside. I think it's all negative. I don't think I struggle to think of many positives that have come out of the sort of extremes of this ideology and the way that it's just been used to bully and browbeat people. At the same time, I think that people's explicit and tacit approval of it all it's past its peak. I'd say it probably peaked somewhere between 2020 and 2021. And now the pendulum has begun to swing back in quite a major way, as far as I'm concerned. I just think that, I think around 2014, 2015, if we go to the early stages, if we go to Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of magazines and stuff, I don't think most people really knew what was going on, right? The word transgender itself, even, like, people weren't familiar with it. People had heard of transvestite, maybe transsexual, but it was like, what even is this word? And it's kind of gets stuck onto the LGBT thing, right? I remember when I was in university, it was just like LGB. And then it became LGBT, and then it became LGBTQ, and then it became I think now it's LGBTQIAA2SP plus or something like that, right? They just kind of keep adding a letter every year. And I think initially there's the just naivety and ignorance where people are like, well, I don't really know what to make of this. I don't know what's going on. And then it gets pushed very, very aggressively, and it hijacks and weaponizes people's compassion to kind of either to get them on the bandwagon or to make them sympathetic towards it. And then they never know when to stop, right? So then they start pushing it to the point of like, oh no, this is not about tolerance. This is about domination. This is about changing laws. This is about changing policies. This is about invading people's space in various ways and trying to control the way they speak. And I think that's when the alarm bells start to go off for people. And then it really, I'll tell you, the line that they massively crossed is when they started pushing stuff on kids. There are certain defining lines in society that are very important. And I would say that this ideology over the past 10 years has violated two of the biggest ones. I think one of the most important divisions that exist in humanity, when I say division, I don't mean like, I don't mean that in a negative way. Distinction maybe is a better word. I think one of the most important ones is male and female. Like, that's a big deal. Like, it's very important to our species and the whole animal kingdom that we recognize the distinction.
Plant kingdom as well. You know, it's in undeniable.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very important that we recognize that distinction. And another one is adults and children. Very important. Culturally, socially, legally, it's extraordinarily important that we have a distinction between an adult and a child. And it's why in every legal system all around the world, they have certain laws that are based on whether someone is an adult or someone is a child. And I think where they really overshot the mark is obviously they'd violated the one between male and female already, sometimes to a dangerous level, very obvious with sports or men and women's prisons, that type of thing, like very obvious what the problem is there. But then I think once you start to violate that line between adults and children, so even people who are like, say if you even took someone who's extremely like liberal or libertarian on this whole issue, they might be like, well, you know, I guess whether they like it or not, they kind of, you know, think, well, if you're an adult within reason, if you're not hurting anyone else, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Like a lot of people in the West hold that position. Even a lot of conservatives would hold that position. But that doesn't, but you draw the line at children, right? You're like, no, not kids, right? Like, no, like if you're an adult, you can generally do whatever you want. If you're a child, no. And this goes for even simple things like getting a tattoo, right? Getting a tattoo is nowhere near as serious as going through like a gender conversion and like taking bits off of yourself or going on hormone therapy or something. Like getting a tattoo is way less serious than that. And we would think it would be crazy to a 10-year-old who wants to get a tattoo. And we're like, yeah, go ahead, tattoo them. We'd be like, no, you can't do that. You can't drive a car. You can't drink alcohol. You can't be smoking cigarettes. You can't be like engaging in certain activities. It's like, no, that's a child. Leave kids out of it. And they crossed that line. And I think that woke a lot of people up, even just the sort of average person who's not all that interested in all of this stuff and considers themselves quite apolitical and they're not into the culture war and all this stuff. They're like, no, this is not right. And they did it with more than just the gender issue. You know, it happened with some of the conversations about race, for example, which is quite a tiresome subject because, you know, we kind of should be past all of it. But when you're going around and you're telling, say, for example, you're telling white children, again, they violated the thing with children. You're telling white children that they're somehow guilty of racism, that they're inherently racist, or that they're guilty of slavery in the past or colonization, and they're somehow responsible for this, or that they're overprivileged over their black friends and their brown friends and classmates. And you're then telling the black kids that, oh yeah, you're, the victim of institutional and structural and systemic racism. And you live in a white supremacist society that is designed to hold you down. Like, imagine telling a child this.
It's time for a quick word from one of our partners. If you believe in the freedom to communicate, the right to privacy, and freedom from corporate surveillance, then you need to check out Proton. Many of you would have heard of Proton Mail. Proton is born out of the desire to create an internet that puts people before profits. Proton helps you to maintain control over your digital life Whether it's sending messages encrypted through Proton Mail or browsing privately with Proton VPN or securely storing your important documents with Proton Drive, Proton is the ultimate tool for safeguarding your digital freedom. Don't let your data be sold or your privacy be compromised. Go to danastingregory.com/Proton and start using Proton to protect your digital life today. Let's get back to our conversation with Zuby.
Talk about trying to just mess up a kid's brain. Like, this is like these are some of the worst things that you can tell children, because children don't care about this stuff. They're just with their friends and with their classmates, and they just like people who are nice to them. And then you're giving them all of these complexes. You're kind of putting all these weird ideas into their head. And yeah, it's just not right. And I think we're at a point where the majority of people recognize that A, it's happening and it is real. B, that it does have real world consequences, and C, that it's not morally right, that it's not a good thing. These ideas they're not pro-social ideas. They're not ideas that like move us forward or create unity or even do what they claim they're supposed to do. They certainly don't diminish bigotry. I would argue that they would encourage it, in fact, because you're taking people who are adopting more of a equalist, colorblind approach, and then you're telling them, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. You should see race. Like you should treat black and white people differently. You should it's like, wait, hang on. I thought the whole fight.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of this Eric K in my head. Martin Luther King don't stand by the quality of his, the color of his skin, but by the quality of his character. I'm thinking, well, now it's all about judging someone by their skin or their gender or their age or whatever characteristic that is the flavor of the month. But and again, you talk about children. I've got a 3-year-old son, and as you know, Bournemouth is not exactly the capital of multiculturalism. It's a very white dominant area, but he does have in the context of Bournemouth, a relatively diverse friendship group. And I watch him, and he clearly doesn't, like, he just sees his friends, he just sees other children, and he freely plays. I can tell that there's no judgment. Yet now in this world, that is now deemed racist. Like, my son's being racist by not openly declaring that he's anti-racist. And by being colorblind, he's a racist child. I'm like, you're crazy. But when you say that out loud, people are like, oh yeah, you do have a point, mate. It's like, but how did we get so lost? Like, how did reason and rationality get thrown out? Right? Like the baby of the bathwater. You know, what and this actually 45 minutes in, coming in to talk about the crisis of masculinity, I do wonder, because, and again, this is going to be an inflammatory statement, even though it's just a stark generalization. Historically, there's almost this association with masculinity, and again, I'm using masculinity, not male or female, or woman or man. There's this association with kind of reason with masculinity and emotion, or rationality with masculinity, and almost emotionality with, or emotion with femininity. And again, there's a whole range in between. I'm very aware of that, but I do wonder where has this imbalance come from? Because we've almost lost the grip on that rationality and reason. It's almost being deemed toxic in the same way that masculinity is being deemed toxic. Do you see a correlation between kind of the weakening of the male species, mankind, and this cultural situation? Have we lost the strength of will and character to actually defend our principles rationally and reasonably? And are we getting kind of curtailed by this over-emotionalized, hyper-ideological position? Does it trace its roots to this imbalance between masculine and feminine? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and it's an interesting one. And I think, yeah, obviously, we live in increasingly feminized societies. I would say that every single Western country is a feminine primary social order. What I mean is that it's almost the opposite of, it depends on how you look at it, because I can see how someone, particularly, I could see how a feminist who's not doing some deep analysis, or even a man who's not, could look at the things and say, oh, well, most of the leaders are men and most of the CEOs are men, and men in general are still earning more money, right? So therefore patriarchy. But I think when you actually dig a little bit deeper, you see that everything has been reorganized over the past several decades. I say certainly since before the time we were born, to be more feminine primary. I won't even say female primary necessarily, but I think part of this is, again, just the comfort and the peacetime. I think that the more real problems you have to deal with and the more everyday societal issues and survival issues you have to deal with, the more masculinity is valued and the more the gender distinctions become obvious, right? So if you want to, let's say that we have some sort of massive crisis or apocalyptic scenario. It could be in the UK, it could be in the US, it could be in Canada. You will very, very quickly see the assumption of gender roles, right? People get stuck on an island. 20 men and 20 women get stuck on a desert island. You will very quickly see those modern people revert back to rather basic gender roles. Like it just happens.
Do you actually think that would happen?
Yes, I do.
I mean, even looking at COVID. So, for instance, let me take you to COVID. So, in the UK, I was an integral part of the protest movement here, right? And I was heavily involved at every level. And very early on, it was women on the street. It was very much female led. The people, and maybe it's because there's a piece there which is there's a closer affinity to intuition within the feminine, and therefore they didn't have to rationally dissect. Did the number of COVID tests or did it correlate with actual real disease and all these different rational points that we've argued upon for the last 4 years. But the men took an awful long time to stand up. And I'm curious now with this kind of weakening of men, whether that gender role would automatically recalibrate.
It's such a fascinating conversation because I've made the same observation multiple times during that era that I was seeing in some ways. I don't know if it could just be my sort of selection bias from what I was seeing, but I was seeing a lot of the more prominent people standing up against it. I was kind of seeing, it seems to be more women than men in a certain way. There's a couple different ways to look at it. I think that one of them is women tend to be organizers more in general. Like if you look at, not every protest movement, but certainly like a lot of them, they are female led and driven, like in terms of gathering people together. Again, whether it's BLM or it's a anti-lockdown protest, I think that sort of organization, not just now, but even when I look at certain things historically, it seems to often be women definitely play a major role in that. I don't know if the sort of male independence thing makes it less likely to get involved with that. I don't know exactly. So I totally get the point you're making, because you would think, hey, like men should take a stand here, right? Men should be less afraid of this thing than women are. I do wonder if part of it was because the threat actually wasn't that big.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean? Like yes. I do wonder if it were like a real, like a just not something with any subjectivity, like a real, a forest fire, a flood, something that puts people like real and immediate physical danger. I do think when those situations happen, you do see men step up.
If you've got someone knocking at your door, that instinct is gonna kick in. Whereas this invisible idea, this invisible threat, it's very different and also your point on the movement building is very interesting, because again, men tend to be kind of lone wolves. It's not that they won't participate, but they'll do their thing their own way. So I think maybe you are right. If we did have that, there would be some sort of recalibration.
Yeah, for sure. But let me loop back to what I was saying earlier, because I was talking about this sort of feminine primary social order. But yes. I think if you look at everything from like, if you even look at, okay, let's kind of go through a lot of it. So first of all, sadly, we're living in an age and in a place where we're pretty much at an all-time high of children raised by single mothers. I don't know the percent in the UK. I think it's over 30, probably around 30%, I would estimate. Someone can fact check me on this. I think the USA has the second highest in the world. I think the USA is over 35% of all households are single mother households now. So you're having boys and girls, let's say 1 in 3, growing up in that environment. Maybe another 1 in 3, the father is, he's around, but maybe he's not all that involved, or maybe he's at work all the time and so on. So you have millions upon millions of people over the past decades growing up either without a father in the home or not very present. So certainly that's a factor. And then if you look at schooling, schools are more suited for girls than they are for boys. If you just look at the way schooling is done, 20 kids, 30 kids, all sit down in a class. Almost all of the primary school teachers are women. Obviously, everyone working in daycares and so on are women, over 90%. And so you're having a lot of young children growing up where actually they're not really interacting with, perhaps not even just their own father, but like they might not be interacting with men much in general. And I just think the way the schooling system is done, particularly when you start even taking out things like physical education and research, there's not that much. And then you add all the safetyism, right? I think that is female primary, right? This whole idea of everything needs to be safe, right? Safe, like everything. If you even look at almost every couple, most couples who have children, the father tends to be the one who is encouraging the risk-taking behavior and allowing the kids to, muck about a bit more and do more dangerous things, maybe fight a bit more and so on. And the mother tends to be the one who doesn't really want them to do it. There's this beautiful yin-yang that goes on. Yes, of course, there's exceptions and there's situations where that's going to be inverted. But in general, you can quite clearly see the sort of masculine role and the feminine role. And due to a zillion different reasons over the decades, the masculine role has slowly dissipated to the point where, yeah, it's still present, it's still there, but all of these years later, there's been an absence of it at all these different stages of development. And then you look at university now, I mean, it's pretty much 2 to 1 women to men going to university. And then this has a greater snowball effect then, because you have all these women coming out with degrees and they're earning more money and so on, which is cool, like good for women. But increasingly, they themselves are sort of now pricing themselves out of the dating and mating market because they are finding fewer what they consider eligible men who they consider, they're equal or a bit better than them in some aspects, a man that they can like look up to and who can do that, be a provider and so on. It's getting harder. So all of these things have been in play. And I think that there's been such a push, again, in all of the West, there's been a feminist push heavy since many decades before we were born. And I think that one of the issues with the way that it's happened is, how would I put it? I often say that sometimes people forget that you can uplift a group without diminishing another one. And intentionally or unintentionally, the modern feminist movement has done a horrible job at this, right? So it wasn't just, hey, let's uplift girls and women. It was, no, let's usurp the power, whether it's real or perceived, that men have. We need to take this away from the men, smash the patriarchy, right? Like we need to take it away. So there hasn't been any movement. Think our entire lifetime. It's only in the last couple years, and probably due to podcasts and stuff like that, that there's even beginning to be some sort of mainstream conversation about the crisis of masculinity. Our entire life, there's been no talk of that. There's been plenty of talk about girls are oppressed and the wage gap and the future is female and we need to raise, so there's been so much focus on girls and women at the absence or even to the detriment of boys and men, in the same way that you've got these movements which are not just like, hey, let's uplift and offer opportunities to Black people or minorities. It's like, oh no, let's tear down the white man. Like let's you see what I mean? It's not just like, hey, let's try to uplift this group. It's like, no, let's pull this one down. It's kind of it's quite communistic, right? It's like it's the eat the rich mentality. Instead of saying, hey, poverty is a problem, how can we help and uplift people who are in poverty. It's like, no, we need to eat the rich. We need to tax them even harder. We need to like destroy the 1%, like all those rich people, we need to go after them. And so I think a lot of that mentality has been applied to the gender situation. And what's fascinating about it is it results in a scenario where neither sex is actually happy, right? So women are increasingly unhappy and finding it more difficult to find and partner up and get married and have children with a good man. You talk to, any young woman, they believe that that's harder now than it was for their mother or for their grandmother. At the same time, men are feeling like, hey, sure, we have had a lot of progress and we do have many more opportunities in many ways than our grandparents and great-grandparents. But at the same time, it's definitely way more difficult to buy a house, to get married, to start a family, to do like all of these basic things that, yeah, cool, we've got these amazing gadgets and we've got the internet and social media and we can invest in Bitcoin and crypto and like we can do all this cool stuff. But it's like, what about the basics, right? Like, what about the basics of, hey, actually, I'd quite like to get married and have a family and buy a house and raise kids and be able to afford to do this and not feel like it's this huge battle. And so, yeah, there's a lot that's at play here, but I kind of think that that's a bit of a long-winded summary of some of the things that are at play.
Well, it encompasses a lot. And it made me think, who threw out Maslow's hierarchy of needs? It's just those fundamental baseline survival pieces have been usurped by attention, this almost ADHD culture, which is just hyper focused on cultural means as opposed to depth of foundation fundamentals that you kind of touched upon there. People like Jordan Peterson have said that men are in crisis. We have this crisis of masculinity. Do you actually think it is? Based on what you've just shared, do you think this is a crisis of masculinity? Is this a point where we need to see change?
I think there's an issue. I hesitate to use the word crisis because it's a little too. I think it's over-egging it a little bit.
We live in a perma-crisis was Collins' word of the year 2 years ago.
Yeah, like I've said before, crisis and emergency. Like I've said before, hey, if it lasts for 2 years, it can't be an emergency. So yeah, but I guess the word gets people's attention. But I'm afraid of what I call label inflation. Diluting a word too much. Yeah, I think that there's definitely an issue, and I think it's good that the conversation is happening more. And when you even say it, I think people, whether or not everyone can articulate the exact problems and do some type of analysis, I think people do sort of feel what is meant when that is said. I think that the idea that boys and men are just like killing it and the girls are like, and oppressing the women in the meantime, and the girls are just struggling and they can't do this and they can't do that. Like that narrative is, for anyone paying attention, that's a pretty hard narrative to sell these days. Again, in the West, right? I'm not talking about all around the globe. There are places where this is absolutely true. But I mean, you're not going to convince me that women in America or in the UK are like oppressed, and that the guys are just like smashing it. It's like, no. I'll tell you another thing that happens here, Dan, is something called the apex fallacy, which is that when people have these conversations, and a lot of these very vocal feminists, they do this all the time. They always do the apex fallacy, which is that they only look at the very, very top of society. So they look at the top 0.1% of people in society, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, like it's mostly men. Like you look at the top 0.1% of income earners or wealth or positions of power, so on. And yeah, you're going to find it's very male dominated. But what if you look at the bottom 1% or bottom 0.1%? What if you look at the homeless people? What if you're looking at the people who are like heavily depressed and considering suicide? What if you're looking at, the drug addicts and alcoholics? Oh, lo and behold, the prison population, right? Heavily skewed male. So that's the thing with it, but they don't talk about that part, right? So you could probably, I would say it's probably the case that, I don't know how you'd even measure this, but I think in 2024, in most Western countries, you could probably make a case that, and it depends on how you measure this, and I'm being a bit subjective here, you could probably make a case that the average woman is better off than the average man. But if you look at the tip top or the bottom, like if you look at the very top, it looks like men are doing better than women at the very, very top, and men are doing worse than women at the very, very bottom.
Yeah, I suppose that's also probably predicated on a kind of traditional idea of what doing well means is, prospering financially, being in roles of power, for instance. But of course, there is a whole range of parameters.
That's why I say it's subjective. I think it's certainly true at the very top and at the very bottom of economics, social status, those type of symbols of success. Yeah, you're going to see more men at the very top, right? There's going to be more male CEOs. And if you look at the top athletes or things like that, it's going to be predominantly men. But like I said, if you're going to do that, if someone is going to do that and they're going to be reasonable and fair, it's like, okay, well, let's also look at the bottom. Let's also look at the people who are like really doing badly in society. And again, I think there's probably like out of every 4 homeless people or 5 homeless people, there's probably like, I'd assume out of every 4 homeless people, 3 of them are going to be men, maybe even 4 and 5.
And what's interesting as well is when you look at the bottom end of the scale, there's almost this sentiment that kind of percolates that they must have fucked up. They've made bad life choices. The conversation doesn't become about being systemic. It doesn't reflect back. I mean, some people obviously bring it back to the system, but there's no kind of parallel discussion around the systemic failings that have resulted in that bottom part of the equation being what it is. And I think even if we can't define what the clear root causes are, I think there are plenty of symptoms. And I'm curious what, if we're not going to use the term crisis, what to you would be some of the symptoms that the male species in the Western developed world is suffering?
Yeah, you make a very good point there. And I would add a little bit to what you just said, which is that there's not a lot of sympathy for a man at the bottom. He doesn't get a lot of sympathy from men or from women.
That's right.
In fact, if someone says the word bum or says the word loser, do you ever even think of a woman? No, you think of a man. If you hear the word loser, you automatically associate that with a man. You hear the word bum, you automatically associate, yeah, right? You don't even think like aren't there female losers? Surely. But we don't even use that terminology because as a man, both men and women in society as a whole, they tend to view you somewhat through the symbol of, women complain a lot about, not wanting to be seen as sex objects or beauty objects. And I totally get that. But, men could say, hey, like, we're not just success objects, right? Or status objects. But it's just kind of like, look, this is just, it's the way our society is hardwired. There's reasons for it. There are all sorts of double standards that exist. And I don't spend a lot of time complaining about double standards because almost all of them have a biological and cultural informed reason to exist. If you give me any double standard between the sexes, whether or not I think it's good or bad, you can probably just root the reason it exists to biology, like it's got some type of function and reason for existing. But coming back to your question, I want you to can you say your question one more time because I want to actually answer it accurately.
The second part of the question was, if we're avoiding the term crisis but recognizing that there is a problem within the male species, I'm curious what you see as some of the symptoms of that problem are.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, okay. Well, there's some we can be objective with. Testosterone rates declining, and sperm counts declining at about 1% per year. That is very significant and scary. Like 1% per year, that's a big deal. I think something like the average man in 2024 has the average testosterone level of like a 60-year-old in 1980, something like
Crazy.
that. So biologically and hormonally, there is something going on, and you can't really be more objective than that. And that has all sorts of repercussions. There's other things that we could consider. You could certainly consider economic factors. In terms of nominal amount, obviously we make more money in terms of just the hard number than our dads or our grandparents did, but there's a thing called inflation, which is absolutely brutal. So if you actually look at the purchasing power of money and you look at the typical man and woman's ability to purchase a home, for example, or to feel like they're economically in a position to have a children and have dependents and be able to look after them and so on. These basic things are getting increasingly out of reach. Part of the problem is that people's expectations and standards have also been a bit warped. But objectively, I mean, let's take the UK. The typical house in the UK used to cost, this is just going back to like the 60s or the 70s, it used to cost something like 3 times the average salary, right? So maybe the average salary, let's say at a time when the average salary was £4,000 a year, the typical house cost £12,000 a year. Now, the average salary in the UK is, I don't know off the top of my head,
somewhere in the mid-20s.
Let's say £25,000. And maybe the average house in the UK now costs £280,000. I would estimate maybe 300,000. So let's say now the average house is costing somewhere in the region of 12 to 15 times the average salary. And this has all happened in a few decades. So when that is the situation, it's very understandable that increasing numbers of people, particularly young people, are a bit like, hey, something has gone wrong here. This doesn't quite seem like a fair deal. So I can easily make the argument that a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old in 2024 is better off in many, many ways compared to previous generations. We can make that argument. But also in other ways, some of them which you can't objectively measure. You could also say, well, it's a lot harder in some ways. And some of those things are the things that I would argue give people the most meaning and purpose. So a big one, for example, like a huge one, and this affects men and women. I mean, family formation, everything around marriage and having children and having successful marriages and community and family and extended family, all of that stuff is, boy, that's taken a beating. It's taken an absolute beating over the decades. And it is one of the most fundamental and important things, not just for the individual, but actually for the society and the nation as a whole. If you consider the fact that every single Western country has a below replacement birth rate. That every single one, no exceptions.
Wow.
That is pretty crazy. Like when you think about it, that's actually crazy. And there are reasons for that. It's not that all of a sudden nobody wants to have children anymore, or like everyone suddenly became infertile or something. It's like all these previous things that we're talking about, they have consequences. And whether you're a young man or you're a young woman, whether you're 20 or you're 30 or you're 40, I think we could probably objectively make the case that it is more difficult to do and achieve those things than it used to be in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Like it's not impossible. Of course it's not impossible. And people still do it and will continue to. But it certainly is harder and harder for more and more people. And as a result, those families are not forming. When they do, they're not as likely to even stick together. If children come in, fewer children are coming into the picture. And if they do, it tends to be happening much later. It's fewer numbers. And what's fascinating, I'll tell you what's really fascinating about this is, even if you're very aware of these issues, it still has an impact. It still has an impact on you. So I sometimes think about the fact that, if I were born, let's say 30 years earlier, let alone 50 years earlier, I think there's a 99% chance I would be married with at least 4 children by now, if I'd been born a few decades earlier.
What's your status? What's your status now? Are you married to kids now?
I'm engaged.
Oh, congrats.
I'm engaged. All right. And I will have kids, but it's like, and I'm a bit of an odd case because I've taken this weird creative entrepreneurial journey and so on, but it's in the past. So if you think prior to the 60s, sex children, parenthood, and marriage were all connected. Not just connected, but they all like just kind of went hand in hand. And then in the 1960s, with the invention of the pill and birth control and the sexual revolution and abortion, which I think is horrific, but all of these things, they just exploded and decoupled these things from each other. So you can now have sex without the marriage and the children and the parenthood. And you can do this. So people's behavior like massively changed. Again, not every single person, but people's behavior just changed. Because in the past, almost all of human history, it was just like, hey, if you're going to have sex, you're going to become a parent. And if you're going to have sex, you'd better be married. Cultural reasons, social reasons, religious reasons, right? So like all these things just went together. And someone can say, hey, that's too restrictive, it's too conservative, it's too unfair. Like, there's people can argue against that, but whether or not someone thinks that's a net positive or a net negative, it just is. And I think if you're looking at the, if you're looking at a nation or you're looking at communities, nothing has really changed in terms of what is optimal for children and optimal for society. Like it hasn't, despite the technology and the culture and the progressivism and all this liberalism or whatever. I mean, again, if someone wants data and studies, you can just look at the data and studies on this, right? Look at the outcomes overall of a child, millions of children raised in single mother or single parent families versus raised in a stable nuclear family with two parents. And on an individual level, you might not see glaring differences, but when you expand it to millions and millions of people, it's major. The majority of men in prison didn't grow up with fathers. There's like some very, very glaring statistics on a lot of this stuff. And we live in, like a lot of the things we've talked about, Dan, we live in this age where, people avoid talking about a lot of these things because it's not deemed politically correct, or they're so worried about offending someone or stepping on the wrong foot or not dropping the right caveat, saying the right thing. And what's fascinating about this particular one is the more things go in this direction, the harder it becomes to talk about, because the more and more people are directly and indirectly feel implicated in it in some way. So if you're in a room of 100 people and you even make an obvious, objectively true statement that all things being equal, it's better to be raised by a father and a mother than just one or the other, you're probably going to be stepping on the feet of like 30 to 40 people in that room.
It's now caveat culture. So now you have to consider, and Chris Williamson was talking about this on his show recently, he was saying he's just tired of having to caveat everything he says because there's those exceptions. Because everyone is going to, his audience or people will have this inflamed reaction to this thing because you didn't speak to their specific situation. So, caveat A, caveat B, and you've almost got, we want to have a conversation now. We would have spent, an hour and 20 minutes getting all the caveats out of the way before we could even get started, So we can't just, and again, I pride myself in being a complexity systems thinker, and I could, but sometimes we have to zoom in on the kind of key points, and that requires us to, unless we've got all day, to make some assumptions that those caveats are considered. But we can't get away with it now. So it's
interesting because that response, again, it's a very this is going to sound sexist, and it's not, but it's a very feminine way of thinking to react to such a thing in that way. Right, that emotional response to any sort of generalized statement, and always wanting to point out the exceptions and point out, well, there's this, and what about me, and what about, it's like, well, not everything is like we need to be able to make generalized statements and observations. It's implicit that exceptions exist, like
yes.
To the point where I shouldn't need to say it. Right, if I say that human beings have 10 fingers and 10 toes, I'm saying that being fully aware that there are people who are missing entire limbs, or who like lost a finger in an accident, or who only have like I'm fully aware of that. But it would be ludicrous for me to, every time I make that statement, to say, oh, well, drop all the different caveats and so on. So if I say, men are taller than women or stronger than women, I'm not saying every single man on earth is taller and stronger than every single woman. If I say so I think people just get bogged down so much in all of these things, and everyone's so worried to ever offend that sometimes it prevents some really important conversations from happening. And I think the one we're discussing right now, for example, I think it's an extremely important conversation. And I think that everyone knows that it is, but everyone wants to kind of dodge it because you don't really win any popularity points from saying it. And it can sound like you're being, if you don't do all the caveats, it can sound like you're being insensitive, or you're saying something that you're not saying, or you're trying to guilt or shame people or even attack people or something. And it's like, no, I'm not saying this. I'm not trying to attack a single mother or attack a single father or say that they are like this, or say that if you were raised in that environment that you're somehow, no, obviously we're not saying any of this. We're just trying to say, like, on a societal level, on a national level, on a large scale, there are certain standards and targets that are important to have. And when you have standards and targets, not everyone is going to meet them. Okay? It is better to be at a healthy body weight and to be physically in shape than it is to be overweight or obese or morbidly obese, right? It's better. It's better to have a healthy population than an overweight or a massively obese population. By saying this, am I attacking anyone? No, I'm not attacking anyone. Am I saying that I have zero sympathy or zero understanding of how someone can get overweight? No, of course not. I've been overweight myself. Food is delicious. It's a lot easier to eat a ton of food and not exercise than it is to limit how much you eat and to exercise. Like, I get it. I'm not attacking. I'm not shaming anyone. It's just like, hey, standards are important. And if we actually want to improve our society and our nation, we at least at a minimum, obviously we have to do things, but the first step is being able to talk about a situation. If we're not allowed to talk about obesity, how can we fix it? If we're not allowed to talk about some of the issues that are going on with women or some of the issues that are going on with men, how on earth can we fix it? If we're not willing to acknowledge, hey, like, why does the birth rate keep on dropping and dropping and dropping? And what's, like, are we going to have a future if this keeps going on? You look at somewhere like South Korea. South Korea is down to 0.7 births per woman. That means that nation is scheduled for a 95% population decline within a couple generations if they don't do something about it. I think that conversation should be had. I think people should talk about that and go, wait, what is going on? Like, we haven't been here before. What is going on? And people are willing to do it on many other issues, right? Like climate change, right? Everyone loves talking climate change. People love talking about all sorts of other things. So it's like, okay, well, I would certainly argue that some of these things are more pressing. But why don't we just put this all on the table? And I don't know the perfect solution to everything. I have ideas. But the first step is to being able to talk about them.
I think some would argue that the reduction in population is part of the overall strategy and the climate conversation.
I don't have my tinfoil hat on.
Look, Zuby, this has been a fascinating conversation. What advice would you give to modern men? Originally I was going to ask you the question about young men, but I think it's not limited to young men right now. I think men of different ages are grappling with a lot of the things we've talked about today. So I'm curious to know what advice would you give to men in general about in the West about navigating this particular time in history?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. I feel a bit I feel a bit underqualified to answer it. I feel like as a man, there's many things and I need to do and achieve before I can sort of answer this with authority. But I will I'll give my best effort. Firstly, I'd say that I can only speak for individuals here, but that's fine because it's individuals who are listening. So I don't have some like collective solution. I think as an individual, you want to do your best to try to fulfill your potential. And I mean that on every front. I mean that in terms of your physical health, in terms of your mental well-being, in terms of your skill set, in terms of your job and career prospects and what you're doing there, in terms of your network, your friendship group, your acquaintances, all of that, in terms of your soul, your spirituality. I know not everyone is deeply religious, but that element is certainly important. And just genuinely do your best to be the best that you can be. And that is an infinite lifelong goal, because it's almost by definition, it's impossible to actually fulfill your potential. But find the area where it's like obvious that you're lacking. And if you're a guy and if you're overweight, if you're many pounds, stone kilos heavier than you should be, and you're not working out, and you're just eating rubbish, and you're just boozing, and like, very obvious starting point. All right, like get work on getting yourself in shape. If you're eating a rubbish diet, clean that up. If you're doing no exercise, get yourself in the gym. Like, do that. If you are a terrible dresser who you just throw whatever clothes on and you don't give a crap what you look like, you know what? Go and get yourself a nice haircut. Get some clothes that fit you well. Like, put them on. Like, and again, not just to be superficial or just to like impress a woman or whatever, just to feel good and confident about yourself, and to present yourself to the world in a way that you feel competent and confident. If you're in a bad financial situation, do your best to get out of it. It's none of these things are overnight. If you're someone, you've got, I don't know, 10 grand in debt, or you're sitting there jobless, you don't have a job or whatever it is, right? These are relatively quick wins. I'd say that the further behind the 8 ball you are on any of these things, the sort of quicker the win. If you're already in good shape, then getting in like even better shape is pretty hard, right? Yeah. But if there's an area where you're just, if you could take lots of these things and put them on a scale of 1 to 10, if there's something where you're like below a 5 in your own like honest opinion, then work on improving it. That's what I would say. And I would also say, enjoy the process and honestly, like, it sounds kind of cheesy, but like, believe in yourself. Believe in yourself. Recognize that most extraordinary men or extraordinary people are relatively normal individuals who have just chosen to do something extraordinary or made many, many day-to-day decisions and habits that over the course of time, over the course of 10, 20, 30 years, it builds up to something that's quite extraordinary. So if you can master your habits, try to put to rest the negative ones and work on building those good ones over the course of time, certainly over the course of a lifetime, it can amount to things that are quite extraordinary. And you'll be amazed by how many people you can guide, lead, inspire, motivate through all of that process. This is something I'm consistently working on. I would like to think that when I'm in my 40s, when I'm in my 50s, when I'm in my 60s, I'll look back on what I'm doing now and I'll be like, man, I was just warming up, right? So you just keep on going with it. You keep maturing, you keep getting better. And man, this is a long answer. And one more thing I'll say is be of service to other people. We all have unique skills, talents, experiences, personalities. So the way that I offer value to the world is not going to be the same as the way the next person does it. I have a different personality, different interests, different set of skills. I'm in a different position, but find what those things you have to offer the world are. And if you're ever stuck, if you just think of like, hey, how can I offer more to the world? How can I not just do things for me, but how can I somehow, some way make life better for other people? Then if you do that well, not only will you serve a lot of people, but actually that's also kind of the secret to success. The more people you can serve, the more people you can help in some way, shape, or form, then the more success you will have. So that's a lot of things there, but that's what I put on the plate.
Yeah, well, some wonderful words of wisdom there. And at this point, we're approaching the end of 2024. So don't wait to the beginning of 2025. Yeah, to me, New Year's resolutions are a fallacy. start today. Start, the best day to start was, if it wasn't yesterday, it is today. So, take heed. There's some wonderful words there. Zuby, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. We'll include all of your social channels and projects in the description, so do check below. But where would you like to send people? Where are you most active right now? Where would you like to send people to follow up with you?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on all social media. I'm very active on X, but I'm also on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. All the same handle, at Zuby Music, Zuby Music. And you can check out my podcast, Real Talk with Zuby. Just search Zuby on any platform.
Thank you very much, Zuby. And if you've been watching this with us today all the way through to the end, please do make sure you share this episode with other people, whether it's other men, other people in your community. It's important that we start having this conversation. I will tell you, Zuby, this is the first time I've talked about this subject that we've gone through today. And the reason is I've been nervous about even tackling because of fear of public perception. But I have to confront these fears, because if we don't, then we're all going to self-silence ourselves, self-censor. So thank you for being a wonderful, eloquent speaker on this subject and helping me to navigate these issues today. So please do hit that share button, and we'll see you again very soon on the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite platforms and leave a comment to help more people discover these important conversations. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and every major audio platform. And if you want to be part of the after show conversations and get access to even more exclusive content and behind the scenes insights, remember to join our supporter program at danastingregory.com/supporter. You'll get to hear Zuby's thoughts on the US election, his views on how to tackle crime, how to defend the West, and more. Your support helps us to bring even bigger and bolder conversations to the show. Until next time, live free and prosper.
If I were mayor of London, I'd be sending so many people to prison. You want to run around stabbing people, stealing phones, stealing watches? Nah, one shot and you're in prison. Straight up. I'd be like El Salvador style. In 2024, El Salvador is the safest country in the Western Hemisphere.
How did they get to that?
They put 1% of the population in prison.